G'day everyone, it is my top 20 album countdown. We are up to number 3. It's been a long journey, but we're getting towards the pointy end now, and very proud to say that number 3 is another Australian act, a very long-running Australian act, and for a long time been one of my very favourite bands. Not a hard rock band, a band that to me is the most atmospheric band I've ever heard in my life. Always had a real captivating sound that reeled me in, and I still love them. I see them whenever I can, and I play all their albums religiously, but hard to pick from a catalogue of, I think, 25 or 26 albums now. But this to me is the piece de resistance. I'm speaking about The Church, and the album is Starfish, which came out in April 1988 and produced, by some margin, their best-known track, Under the Milky Way. An absolutely beautiful song that still gets played a heap on radio more than 30 years later. It does make me laugh. People that aren't that familiar with The Church tend to list that, and they might mention The Unguarded Moment, their debut single, which came out back in 1980, as the standouts, but they have produced an incredible body of work. I think a band criminally underappreciated in this country particularly. I love so much of their stuff, and this was another album I really had trouble deciding between this and another in their catalogue, and that was the previous album, Heyday, which I love almost as much as this one. That was produced by Peter Walsh, who produced Simple Minds' New Gold Dream, another album in this list. It's full of orchestral sounds and a real lush production sound. This one does sound a bit different. It was produced by Waddy Wachtel and Greg Ladani, from memory. Yes, Ladani, recorded in the US. And it has a sparser sound, I think, than Heyday. It's sort of stripped back, but that really works because it really promotes the atmospheric, slightly eerie sound that this band generates, and to me has always been a great strength. Magnificent interplay between the two guitarists in this band, Marty Wilson-Piper and Peter Koppes. They just bounce off each other, their two lead and rhythm guitar parts, which are quite interchangeable. Frontman Steve Kilbey on bass, a brilliant lyricist. Kilbey just writes sometimes very oblique lyrics, but very, they leave your imagination room to work out often what the song's about, which I love. And the first drummer from The Church, Richard Plug, this was the last album that he played on. Under the Milky Way is, of course, the massive hit. There was another reasonably hit single, Reptile, which is certainly a rockier, more up-tempo track. But this whole album, as far as atmospherics go, I don't think you can beat this. It is a classic album to a real sonic journey of sorts. Starts off with Destination, which has quite a quiet introduction building up to a bit of a crescendo at the end, but quite a slow tempo. Under the Milky Way, the second track off the album. I love every track off this album. Blood Money often gets overlooked, but I think it's a ripping track. After that, you've got, of course, Lost, which is, again, a quiet song, quite restrained, but very evocative. I think the vocal tracks on this record are particularly good too. The choruses sort of meld seamlessly with the verses. Next track is a ripper, North, South, East and West, written in the US about, a lot of this songwriting on this album is informed by their time spent in the US and the vagaries of living in that sort of US arts entertainment world, and I'll leave it to your imagination what that's sort of talking about. But a great song, North, South, East and West. Marty Wilson-Piper takes the lead vocals on Spark. And then, for mine, a killer 1-2 punch late in this album, Antenna. Truly beautiful song with a brilliantly used mandolin, of all things. It's just such a, again, I keep using that word, atmospheric, but it's such an evocative, rich sounding song, and terrific lyrics as well. And it finishes off this album with A New Season, sung by Peter Koppes, and Hotel Room, another classic Kilby track. Very typical sounding church song, mid-tempo. Great lyrics again. Great guitar solo in the middle of this. It just flows, this album. It's a fantastic driving album, I think. You know, if ever I'm doing a long sort of country drive, I've always got this album going in the background, and the imagery that I guess you create in your mind whilst driving along, listening to these sorts of songs, is terrific. Like I said, you know, they're very, very accomplished musicians. Kilby's, I love Kilby's singing voice too. It's, you know, has that faint sort of English accent. It's quite deep in parts, and not a classic singing voice, but it just works. It really captures the moments. And as I said earlier, the guitar interplay between Koppes and Wilson-Piper, you know, I don't know why I was thinking of other duos, but they just complement each other perfectly. And Koppes in particular just gets wonderful tones out of his guitar, quite low tones too. There's a real, what I love about the Church is, I guess they're known as they produce a jingly jangly sort of guitar sound, but it's not a light-hearted sound. It's quite brooding and enigmatic almost in parts. And if I'm sounding like I'm struggling for words here, they are a band that for me create a lot of rich visual imagery, all their songs, and it's true of their songs off every album they've done. But this one has an extra, I guess, commercial accessibility. Not a surprise it was their, by some margin, biggest selling album. Certainly in the US, you know, Under the Milky Way is a song you've heard on various film scores and soundtracks, and like I said, still played very frequently on radio. But if you've only heard Under the Milky Way, or, you know, if you've heard, say, the Blurred Crusade album or Unguarded Moment from all those years ago, I couldn't urge you more strongly to check out more of their catalogue, starting with this album, because it's a wonderful insight into all the dynamics that make the Church and have made the Church such a wonderful band now for just on 40 years. You know, they are criminally underappreciated in my book. This album wasn't, fortunately, and it is an epic, one of the lighter sounding albums in my collection, but whenever I'm looking for a mood, this is my go-to album. It's an absolute ripper. Starfish by the Church from 1988. Check it out. I'll be back to speak about my number 2 in the top 20 album countdown.